Okay, I think it's live. Hi, everyone. You will notice that it is 3:56 p.m. So we're a little early for Record Live today. But I just wanted to jump on here and let you all know that our Record Live today is a little bit different to normal. We decided what we were going to do was to preview or premiere a video that Jared filmed with Dr. Paul Bogacs. Now, many of you will probably know Paul Bogacs. He is well known, particularly up at Avondale, and he's a lecturer, and I think it's in counselling and psychology. Correct me if I'm wrong, everyone. But I know he's got a lot of experience in that area. And one of our editions in July for Record, we had a special article in there written by Jared, which was on domestic violence and the church. And many of you will have seen on our Facebook page, on Adventist Facebook pages, different platforms around recently, that there is an End It Now emphasis day this Sabbath. So basically that's an initiative by the South Pacific Division, I believe. And it's basically just to highlight the problem of domestic violence inside and outside of the church and trying to combat it in any way that we can. So we thought that this week it would be a really appropriate time to post this video. Yeah, Dr. Paul Bogacs is an amazing guest. He's got a lot of knowledge. So if domestic violence is something that you've experienced or you know someone who's experienced, particularly in the realm of spiritual manipulation, this context of divorce and the church and openness and the discussion around domestic violence, then this is definitely a discussion you don't want to miss. Without further ado, have a wonderful afternoon, guys, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Bye.
But yeah, so the ABC had a report about some guys who are removalists, furniture removalists. They help out domestic violence victims. Mm-hmm. And anecdotally, they reported that their sort of removals had gone up 60%.
Okay. Yep.
But the official sort of figures, some of the official figures, 11% increase on the 1-800-RESPECT line, and 15%, of course, to Men's Line have been linked to coronavirus in particular. The situation that's happening at the moment and some of the pressures on that. Maybe we can start just by you giving me your perspective on what this sort of lockdown idea might be doing to relationships. Where are the pressures coming from, and why might we see domestic violence increase at this time?
I would argue, it'd be my view as a couples therapist, that this is not going to cause domestic violence. Yep. But if there is the tendency towards domestic violence, and we see now domestic violence on a spectrum. I mean, years ago we saw it as black or white. You either hit your wife or you don't hit your wife, simple as that. And then we had all of these women coming forward who said, I wish he would hit me, because then somebody could see the bruises and then they could actually believe how awful and terrible and how horrible it is to live with him. And so we began to have to rethink and go, okay, the domestic violence doesn't necessarily mean you're being hit. And so now we talk about different forms of domestic violence, and we talk about financial abuse, and we talk about physical abuse, and we talk about sexual abuse and spiritual abuse, all as different forms of domestic violence, with the key underlying issue, the process issue, if you like, being control. So, the woman who comes to therapy and says that she's walking on eggshells constantly around her husband because she never knows what she'll get in trouble for next, Surely you're not going out wearing that, are you? And I've known, and I've had women, mate, whose husbands are absolutely convinced that their woman is having an affair, and there's no evidence, no solid evidence other than their suspicion. And I know you are, that's why you're dressing up, that's why you wear makeup when you go out. And you kind of, and it's all about his insecurity.
Paranoia. He's paranoid.
And paranoia, but it means that, she's being constantly controlled. You can't wear that, that's too short, that's too this, that, rather than going, I trust you as my wife that you'll be appropriate, and end of story, the rest is up to you, but I've had men who just micromanage their wives' wardrobe, which is something us men should never try to do, because we don't have a clue anyway. We should just enjoy what our women do with all that. So if you've got control issues that are there, then having people in close proximity with each other for a greater period of time is going to increase the opportunities for control. It means instead of getting out of the house for 8 or 9 hours a day, she's now at home. And if they're both stuck at home, or if it's a situation where normally she's at home and he's out, and so she has 8 or 9 hours where she can be her own person, she can put on the music that she wants to listen to, she doesn't have to watch all her P's and Q's, and that now he's working from home, or worse still, he's lost his job. And then of course you've got that financial pressure if he has lost his job. Then if he tends to be in, have a need for control, now that he's lost control over such an important part of his life, which is his work, because he doesn't have any, it could heighten the desire or the need to have control over the little bit of his life that he feels is left to have control over, which can be his family. So it can be
lashing out to feel power or feel control.
To feel some power, to feel that you have some kind of control over something, even if it's about what my wife does and doesn't do. Of course, that is domestic violence. Now, some of that, we see it on the spectrum because, power and control are issues in all relationships. However, what I look at as a couples therapist is how much fear is there. If somebody says, oh, look, he tries to control me, but I just tell him to pull his head in. Look, I just tell him, I'm not going to have him tell me what to do. He tries to control my spending. Good luck. That ain't ever going to happen. I'll spend what I feel like. Then you kind of go, okay, this is not really domestic violence. There's some control issues rumbling around, but she's strong enough to push back. If, however, he'd married someone else who's very submissive, that could be enough because she doesn't know how to push back. And so, you could say, well, that's at the very, very low end. With the higher end generally being recognized as serious physical injury, even to the point of death, homicide being on the extreme end of that.
And some would say, well, that's very well to see some of these issues in the community, but it doesn't happen in the church. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in the Christian, or especially in the Adventist circles. You work at Avondale there, and you're a Christian relationship counsellor. Are they more people from community you're seeing with these sort of issues, or is it definitely a Christian issue as well? Is it something we should be thinking about?
It's hard for me to judge from my practice because I only have a very small private practice because most of my work's lecturing. So I only see clients on a Tuesday afternoon. So I try desperately not to take new clients. So it'd be very hard for me to judge as to whether something has changed in that area or not, because I don't think I've taken on a new client for a little while. However, domestic violence certainly happens in the Christian church. We know that from surveys that have been conducted. A guy did a workshop last year, and he's an Adventist psychiatrist, wrote the book, The God-Shaped Brain. I'm just trying to remember his name. He actually had some research to show high levels of domestic violence in Adventist families as well. He's actually done some research in the Adventist Church in America. Now, I'm not sure. I have a feeling there's been some research done about DV in Adventist families in Australia, but I don't know, and I wouldn't know where to get my hands on the research. But Jennings certainly had some, and he really believed that it was no better in the church than out of the church. However, there's some other research that comes out of the area of psychology of religion that does indicate that spirituality and religion can be helpful in reducing that. So it depends which surveys, it depends what you look like. Does it happen in the church? You bet. And in the church, of course, one of the things that happens is spiritual abuse. Right. And I've certainly had clients where there's definitely spiritual abuse. This is where the Bible is used as a weapon to control. Right. And that they, the favorite text of men who do this is, wives, submit to your husbands. That's a great one. I'm just doing what God has told me to. After all, God has appointed me the head of the house. And if you don't like that, you take that up with God. I'm just doing what the Bible tells me to do. I've got to be the head of the house. And that can be a great way of rationalizing what basically is abusive behavior and controlling behavior. So using the Bible as a weapon, using one or two texts out of context in order to ask for obedience on behalf of the wife. The text, obviously, that isn't quoted is submit to each other, to each other as to the Lord, which seems to me that the submission thing should go both ways, yes, and primarily should be to God. The determining of behaviour, is a form of spiritual abuse. I can't believe you're listening to that music. Don't you know that music's really bad? Or I can't believe that you ate a piece of chicken last night. Oh, really? I mean, you know what Ellen White says about chicken? Yes. Oh, gee, you drink coffee? Really? Yeah. That to me is not a spiritual issue. That's an issue of domestic violence, really. If that continues now. What I've quoted is pretty low in stuff, but if that continues until the person is trying to control the other person's life through the use of guilt, that's spiritual abuse. It's
and have you heard of a lot of cases where Ellen White is used in that way of the Bible to control and sort of within the family? Do you feel that's a danger that we have as Adventists?
Look, it's certainly a danger. It is probably used in more conservative areas of the church. I'm sure if you did a survey in the eastern states of the US, I think you would find a lot of that. I'm trying to remember how much of that I've seen in my 25 years of practice. Probably not a whole lot, but my sample, would not be representative in the sense that people who are really, really conservative aren't going to end up in the marriage counselor's office.
Not going to go to counselling, no.
Not going to go to counselling because, counsellors delve into that psychology, that humanistic psychology, so they're dangerous anyway. Yeah. So if you're really going to be ultra-conservative, you're probably not going to end up in a counsellor's office, but I am sure Ellen White is used in that way. Again, used as a weapon. I firmly believe that you can prove almost anything from Ellen White if you just take something. You can prove you shouldn't ride bikes. You can prove you certainly shouldn't play cricket or tennis. You can take all kinds of things. So you can prove whatever you want to prove. So you'll find it if that's what you want to do, if that's how you want to use Ellen White. So
another problematic text that comes up, or a theology or an idea, is this idea that Jesus says the only reason for divorce is from adultery and not from abuse or whatever. You should stick it out. Anecdotally, I've heard many people who have come forward eventually with abuse stories have said, well, the church pastor told me such and such, or the elder that I spoke to, or the first person I confided in said I should just submit to my husband and go back and whatever. Using Jesus' teaching that only adultery is the reason for a relationship break. Can you speak to that in terms of knowing as a Christian, hey, maybe this relationship should actually end. It's not healthy, it's toxic or whatever. Is there a biblical justification for that you see in that sort of space?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think there is, but it doesn't come from the proof text method. It comes from looking at an overall teaching of Scripture, which is about the dignity of personhood.
Yep.
And I am a firm believer in marriage and its sacredness. I'm not a believer anymore in marriage at all costs, because I've seen too many people be destroyed by destructive, toxic relationships that, as you said, really need to end. I remember when I did theology here in the 70s, and our practical theology lecturer, now that would be a part of the ministry stream that they do here, but it was called prac theology in those days. Yeah. And I remember the issue coming up, and I remember this guy who was actually quite open-minded for his time, a guy called Gary Williams. And I remember Gary saying to us as students, he said, what will you do if somebody comes to you and tells you that their husband is yelling at them, screaming, hitting, swearing, doing all that sort of thing? What will you do? and I can't remember what we said as a class, but I remember Gary saying, he said, gentlemen, this is really hard for me to tell you, but according to the church manual and according to the church that is going to employ you, you need to do what I have found that's so hard to do over the years, and that's advise women to stay in those relationships, because that's what the Bible asks and that's what the church asks. You will find it really hard, like I have, but this is what we are required to do.
Wow.
Now that, that was said at college in the 70s. I'm sure it's been decades since anything like that has been said, and that certainly wouldn't be said currently by anybody upstairs from me here now. So it comes from, I think, firstly, it comes from a particular interpretation of those texts where Jesus talks about adultery as being the only justification for divorce. And I did some reading years ago. This was, as you're probably aware, Jared, I did get divorced, and this is my second marriage. I think you know that. I think everybody knows that. And I was actually working for the Salvation Army at the time, and I was asked to talk about marriage and divorce. And this was just as I was coming through my divorce. And so I went, oh, crikey, this. And so I decided, and so I went to Koorong and I bought all of the books dealing with divorce that I could think of. And there was 4 or 5 of them there that I got hold of, and I got incredibly depressed because they all had this very black and white view. And so the teaching of the Adventist Church is very similar to teaching of conservative evangelical Christianity. And I remember going, oh, heck, I'm getting divorced. Really, that's the unforgivable sin. And then I found a few others, and I found one from an Australian lawyer, and it was called Divorce is Not the Unpardonable Sin. Ken Crispin, I think, was the guy, if I remember correctly. Probably written in the 90s, I imagine. I can't quite remember. But an absolutely brilliant book. And he takes a broader view of it. And then I found a few other authors. And some of them went back to the original Greek word for unfaithfulness, which I think, if I remember, is porneia. And they suggested that word in the Greek may not be limited to sexual unfaithfulness.
Right.
That you could actually make a case for this being broader. In other words, unfaithfulness rather than just, sleeping with somebody else, rather than just the act of sexual intercourse, that this could actually be a broader term. Now, that brings you to arguments such as if somebody has hit their wife, and if they've yelled at their wife, if they've, and I've worked with women who've been with Christian men who have called them the most horrible names, and they've done that. Every time they've lost their temper, that's where they go. They rather than just saying, oh, heck, I'm mad with you, or like that, they go the full hog and become incredibly abusive. And while they may apologize for that later, that is typical of the cycle of abuse. You get the regret, apology, begging for forgiveness, promises never to do it again. Then there's a slow build up. Then it happens again. Then there's the regret. That's the cycle of abuse. That's very, very well documented. So, if that's happening in the marriage, I would argue that vows have already been broken. That is not being faithful. If I'm doing that to my wife, I'm not being faithful. I'm not being faithful because I promised before God to love and honor her, to cherish her till death do us part. That's not, that, does not include yelling, swearing, abuse, put downs, hitting. Otherwise, if you take that, super literally and only say the act of intercourse with someone else, what about the husband who sexually abuses his daughter? By touching her inappropriately? You go, oh, no, you can't divorce him. Well, you jolly well need to divorce him to protect your daughter. You need to get out of there, and you need to get out of there ASAP, and you need to call the cops, and you need to have him charged because, he's going to do that to somebody else, and, you need to keep your children safe. So, and to me, where there's domestic violence, where there's yelling and hitting and that sort of thing, children are not being kept in a safe environment. And so when I look at the bigger picture of Scripture and the dignity of personhood. How on earth is somebody being faithful to the woman that they have promised to love and protect when that's the behavior? To me, the marriage vows are already broken. They're broken if there's any sexual abuse. They're broken if there's physical abuse. They're broken if there is ongoing emotional abuse. And we're not talking about the occasional time when somebody blows their top once a year because they've just had enough, and then it doesn't happen again for ages and ages, or it never happens again, or the person gets into therapy and figures out why they occasionally lose their temper. We're not talking about that. We're talking about that which is a pattern over years.
Yes.
And I had somebody not long ago, 32-year marriage. The abuse started just before they got married.
Wow.
And even through the divorce, the separation, the divorce, it still continued via email and, so, is that faithfulness? I can't see that as faithfulness. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, it seems like if you read that stuff in context where Jesus is, particularly the Sermon on the Mount stuff, he's suggesting a higher standard of behavior, not a baseline. He says the Pharisees, Moses, the hardness of your hearts, you were just flicking your women off because they wouldn't get pregnant or whatever. You wanted to upgrade, a younger version. That's not good enough. If there's unfaithfulness, whatever that word, I'll go check out that Greek word. But if there's unfaithfulness, then it's a reason. As you said, you've broken the vows. But it seems that he's protecting women and the things that he says in those passages. He's going above and beyond rather than this is the lowest common. This is the baseline behavior. So yes, the marriage is sacred and it's special, and he's emphasizing, hey, protect that relationship. But if, like as you've said, if you could argue that if one person's broken that bond, and if they're abusing that bond, then they have almost killed. You look at the if you're angry with your brother, you've committed murder in your heart. If you put those two things together, you've killed your wife because you're continually killing her soul by
exactly. And I think when you look at the way that God sees humanity, and the high regard that God has for us, and that we're asked to have for each other, then you cannot justify staying in a relationship with domestic violence. It just contradicts everything that God's on about. And that, for me, is the bigger picture stuff, rather than taking, one statement of Jesus that's recorded in 2 or 3 of the Gospels and kind of going, okay, that's what we got, because in a sense, I think it can give men license to not deal with their stuff that's driving their anger and abuse, because they go, oh, well, she's got to stay with me. We're Christians, she's not going to divorce me.
I'm safe from that possibility.
I'm safe for that, so I don't have to take responsibility for my anger issues, or the fact that my father beat the crap out of me when I grew up, and I've never come to terms with that, and I had modelled a whole lot of aggressive behaviour. And so therefore I'm now following that, not even aware that I'm just a carbon copy of my father, just a watered down version of my father.
Just to dig into that a little bit deeper. So we've talked a bit about those who are being abused, but as the common saying goes, hurt people, right? So people, as you've saying, if you've been abused as a child, you might break the cycle, or you might continue the cycle. You might have hang-ups that have given you because of those that make you act differently, but it's still a shortcoming potentially, or you may heighten that cycle and make it worse to the people in your life. What about those people? Is there redemption for them? What do we say if someone potentially reads some of the stuff we put together and thinks, oh, maybe I do have a problem with that. There is a cycle in my life that, can we just speak, because I know you've got to go soon, but can you just speak to that side of the abuse a little bit?
Yep. Yeah, definitely. People who use abusive behavior are stuck in a pattern of behavior that they themselves don't know how to get out of. And a lot of that is because they promise their partner and themselves and actually believe, I'm never going to do it again. Rather than going, I could do it again, and I'm actually going to need accountability, I'm going to need help, I'm going to actually have to see what the monsters are under the bed that I keep trying to ignore. Because I would argue that with abusers, there's a whole lot of stuff that they haven't dealt with other than try to avoid it and deny it. So we might, if you'd like to use, Carl Jung's term, he had coined this delightful term called the shadow side. And as Christians, we try to pretend the shadow doesn't exist. But you ignore the shadow at your peril, because the shadow is that part of you that you don't like. But that part of you that you don't like will come and sabotage you if you don't make peace with it. Because if I know that I have an issue with anger, then I can actually channel that in different ways. I can channel my energy that goes into anger, I can channel that into other ways, and I can make sure that's constructive rather than destructive. I can take up a sport and make sure that the extra energy goes out that way. I can actually look at what's driving my anger. What is there pain from the past that I need to deal with? Is there hurt? Because anger is often about hurt that hasn't been processed. So by looking at my shadow, I can go, let me talk to that part of me that I don't like very much, because that's the part of me that, as much as I push it down every now and again, it comes out, and then I do stuff that really, really hurts people. And so I think accountability and self-awareness, being able to understand what's actually driving that. And what the typical pattern is of abusers, they externalize. Well, she should know that I have to eat at 6 o'clock. She should know that I need to eat at 6 o'clock. My mother always had the dinner on at 6 o'clock. So what on earth's going on with her serving up the dinner at 6:30? How dare she? That's got to be explored, because that's not about her. It could be 1,000 reasons why dinner's late, and he could get it himself. It's about, what is it about him that he's so rigid in his thinking, that he, and what is it about his attitudes, his idea of the place of women and what their role actually is. There's all kinds of stuff that he actually has to come to terms with and make a shift in thinking. What does it really mean from a Christian point of view to be head of the home? If you want to have headship, and I'm not big into headship theology, but some people are, I think you can do that in a non-abusive way. Headship, believing in the headship of the male doesn't have to be abusive. It can be headship in the terms of, I take responsibility and leadership to protect, care, and nurture and make sure everybody in this family can become the best version of themselves that God could possibly make them to be. That means I give lots of autonomy and I encourage people to make own choices, and I don't micromanage and I don't do any of that, but also realize the buck stops with me and I'll make tough decisions, whatever. That model of headship I can live with. I think there's other ways to do Christian marriage as well, but that's one way, and I'm happy for people to do that. But it's got to be while people's autonomy is encouraged rather than discouraged, because it seems to me that that's what God does. God could force me to do good, but he doesn't. He wants me to make those choices. And God, I think, often has plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D, and is happy for me to choose from a number of options. So I think, I think the two things are being, there's probably two or three things. There's certainly attitudinal change that is needed. There's dealing with some of the demons from the past, some of the hurt and pain. We tend to store that like a gunny sack, on our back. And then when we get frightened, we bring out the ammunition, and then we start to fire off and we become abusive. And I think the third thing is accountability. I think it's really, really important for men to know, men who are perhaps prone to abuse, that there is a line, and if I cross that line, I will lose my marriage, and I may even end up with the cops arresting me. And I think there's got to be that bottom line. And as counsellors, we spend a lot of time with women, and I've said to some women in these situations, I've said, what does he have to do before you go, that's it? Yeah. How bad does it have to get? What you've described to me horrifies me. How bad does it have to get before you actually go, that's it, he's out of here, I'm calling the cops, I'm having him charged? What does he have to do? Does he have to actually kill you? Does he have to come close to killing you? How bad does it have to get before you have that line? And I think where there's no line, there's no accountability. And being the perverse creatures that we are as human beings, I think we need to know there are consequences for actions. And the consequence may be, I will lose my marriage. Yeah.
And I think often that line comes when, just in my observation, when the children are threatened. Sometimes you can do whatever you like to me, but if you go after my children, then I'm upset and I'll finally take action. So it may take many years of abuse before they feel the children are in danger, and then they'll up and leave because they're trying to protect the children. So it's almost like there's no self-preservation instinct, perhaps because they've been abused, through childhood, or there's a pattern there in their lives. But as soon as their children are in danger, that's the line, perhaps, for some people. Selfishness is almost the antithesis of Christianity, isn't it, really? If people have undealt with selfishness, if people see that that's how their character is, then obviously they're not wrestling with God to build the character of Christ in themselves.
Well, they're not being honest about their own journey and their own pain and how it's affected them, and how they've become damaged, and now they're just passing that on to others in their family.
Well, we've run out of time, Paul. I don't want to keep you. Any final sort of comments or thoughts that you'd like to suggest if someone's reading this, or some encouragement, or some take-home points that they can?
I think if the Christian message means anything, surely it's a strong statement about how we treat each other. And the thing that I want people to take away from is, if you are in a relationship where domestic violence has escalated during COVID, go and get some help. Go and speak to somebody. There are domestic violence hotlines. There's Lifeline. There's all kinds of help now in society. And if you are somebody who lashes out every now and again, who has some kind of need to control their partner, go and talk to somebody. Go and talk to a good counsellor. Work through what it is that's driving you, that you need to control another person, because that's not about godliness, and that's not about following the scripture. That's the carnal nature. That's not the that's not the divine nature. That's something we need to come to terms with. What is it about me that I need to control another person? What fears do I have? Why am I so frightened and terrified that I need to do this to another person?
Hey, thanks for your time, Paul. That's been really informative and I think useful.